Hello, friends. My name's Gord Gubitz, and I'm a neurologist from Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I'd like to extend today a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Heart and Stroke Foundation to the 2022 Hnatyshyn and Louise and Frank Nieboer Lectures. We're coming to you live from Prince Edward Island, from Charlottetown, and broadcasting from coast to coast to coast across the country and to all our ships at sea. Today, we're located in Mi'kmahi, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. I'm going to introduce the Nieboer Lecture. So the Nieboer Lecture was established in 2021 to acknowledge and honor outstanding members of our community who've directly experienced and been impacted by stroke, or who have selflessly turned their personal experiences into a mission to help others traveling a similar journey. This lecture is named in honor of Frank and Louise Nieboer. Louise is an incredible woman and a role model who experienced a stroke at the age of 32. She has spent her life continually making gains and providing hope, light, and inspiration to others. Her husband, Frank, has demonstrated the power of having a soulmate who provides a continual source of strength, generosity, and encouragement to her and to many others as well. Together, they've established several stroke support organizations in Alberta, provided peer support in hospital and in the community to people experiencing stroke. They provided countless hours of volunteer leadership to the Canadian Stroke Network Board of Directors, the Canadian Stroke Strategy, and Heart and Stroke Alberta, and nationally. Frank and Louise, working together with the Canadian Stroke Strategy, created a guidebook to help others start their own stroke support organizations across Canada and globally. They are public speakers and passionate advocates to help improve systems of care, services, and support for people living with stroke and achieving optimal recovery so they can continue to live meaningful lives as active members of their communities. Fortunately, Louise and Frank are joining us today virtually, and we'll have some comments later. The Nieboer Lecture is awarded to an individual, a couple, or family who's made significant and positive impacts on stroke recovery, stroke systems of care, and/or support for stroke people, support for people living with the experience of stroke in Canada. It will recognize individuals, couples, or families who have been engaged in these activities over a long period of time that has resulted in measurable positive impact on the lives of people experiencing stroke. To introduce the Nieboer Lecture today, I'd like to call on Mr. Leonard Baker, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the March of Dimes of Canada. Leonard is the President and CEO of March of Dimes Canada. Please welcome Len Baker.
Thank you, Dr. Gubitz. It's a real pleasure to be with you this evening and have the honor of introducing Angela Wright, who will deliver this evening's Louise and Frank Nieboer Lecture, both virtually and I'm sure virtuously as well. It's my pleasure as President and CEO of March of Dimes Canada to be with you actually for the Atlantic Canada Stroke Congress so that we can continue to find ways to collaborate and work together to enhance outcomes for people impacted by stroke and their families here in Atlantic Canada and indeed across Canada. Since joining March of Dimes Canada in 2018, or 1BC, before COVID as I call it, I work to ensure that our after-stroke program is based on best practices and collaboration. And only through a commitment to both of those important ingredients can we really seek to change the way that stroke survivors experience life in their communities and achieve their goals. This initiative also included launching an innovative partnership with the Heart and Stroke Foundation in early 2021, allowing us to leverage the complementary strengths, expertise, and resources of our respective organizations to optimize stroke recovery and life after stroke. In 2021, we formed our National After Stroke Advisory Committee, co-chaired by Dr. Mark Bailey and tonight's lecturer, Angela Wright. Angela reminds us that stroke can happen at any time. Since experiencing a stroke at the age of 38, Angela has demonstrated an extraordinary commitment to creating positive change right across Canada. As you know, or you will soon learn, hers was not an easy road. She is compelled to share her experience and insights in order to effectively advocate for improved stroke care for patients and community supports and services for stroke survivors and their families. Her journey to create change started only 2 years after her stroke, when she joined the board of directors of the Stroke Recovery Association of British Columbia, now known in the community as After Stroke BC. A year later, she joined the Patient Voices Network to support system improvement initiatives. Angela also shares her experience as a young stroke survivor and is keen to represent the needs of her peers. She started the first peer support program for young stroke survivors in BC, which today March at Dimes Canada proudly supports. In 2018, she was instrumental in bringing the After Stroke Hospital Connection Program, formerly the Peers Fostering Hope Program, to the GF Strong Rehabilitation Centre in Vancouver. Angela knows exactly how important peer support is during recovery because it wasn't available to her. That's why she's so dedicated to using her own experience to help and support others impacted by stroke. She's already made significant contributions to local, provincial, and national initiatives, and she's far from finished. I can't think of a more deserving person to deliver tonight's lecture. It is my immense pleasure to introduce virtually the remarkable Angela Wright.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's such an honor to be recognized for this award. I wish so much that I could be there with you in person today. Unfortunately, last weekend I ended up testing positive for COVID, and so that has me isolating at home and instead of being with you in lovely Charlottetown. So I apologize that I'm not there to share this message with you in person, but I'm super grateful for the fact that we have technology today that allows me to do this from my living room and be there with you virtually. I'm so grateful for the Heart and Stroke Foundation and for Frank and Louise for putting this award together, because I do believe that the voice of lived experience is really important in stroke care and improving things and improving outcomes for people living with stroke going forward. I wanted to share with you my experience with stroke and highlight for you some of the aspects that people with lived experience may be living with that you may not have thought of before. I'm specifically going to highlight some aspects of mental health. I think we all know that depression and anxiety are often a big part of a stroke survivor's journey, but what we don't often hear as much about is the loss of personal agency and how that can really impact one's recovery. My story began in November 2011. I was on the road for work visiting clients in northern British Columbia. I decided to stay for a few extra days and go fishing with my client and good friend Murray. And after a couple of days of fishing, I woke up in the morning with the absolute worst headache I've ever had in my life. Given that the night before had ended around the campfire around 3 a.m., I at first thought perhaps maybe there was a little too much whiskey being passed around the campfire and maybe I was just a bit hungover. But soon it became apparent that this was no ordinary headache. My headache got worse throughout the day, and as we drove back into Smithers, extreme nausea took over. We got to Murray's house and was having dinner with his wife, and she was asking me what was wrong, and I kept insisting that I was fine. I just had a really, really bad headache. And she said, "No, Angie, look at your lap." And my glasses, I'd been wearing glasses at the time, had fallen off my face and were sitting in my lap. And we thought, how strange, how did my glasses fall off? And as it turned out, my left ear was sitting a few inches lower than it normally does because all of the musculature in my scalp had gone lax and my ear was lower, and so my glasses fell off my face. And that was really the first indication that there was something seriously wrong. I had the really bad headache, I had the extreme nausea, and I had really bad uncontrollable hiccups. But until my glasses fell off, there was no real indication that there was anything very bizarre going on. They kept insisting at that point that I should go to the hospital, but me being me, I said, no, I'm fine. I just need to drink more water and maybe I'll go to bed early. It's fine, I just have a bad headache. And so I kept putting it off for a while until they finally insisted that their neighbor, who was the fire chief and head of the first responders, that he come over and check me out. And so I agreed that he could come, and he took one look at me and said, no, she needs to get to the hospital. So I finally agreed, and off we go to the Smithers Hospital. The emergency room was staffed by a doctor that night who said that she thought that it looked like I was having a stroke, but that made no sense. I was 38 years old, very healthy, very fit, had no health risks that you would think of for stroke. I'd never been a smoker. I had no high blood pressure. Nothing weird was going on. She said, it looks kind of like you might be having a stroke, but that makes no sense given everything else. So she said, we're going to have to do some more tests, but you're very likely going to end up having to be medevaced to Vancouver. The problem with that, she said, was that the only way she was allowed to call the jet to come and pick me up was if it was 100% confirmed that, yes, it was a stroke. And the only way to do that was with a CT scan. And unfortunately, at that time, the hospital in Smithers did not have a CT scanner. So their protocol said, rather than get the jet to get me to help, they had to send me by ambulance 3 hours up the highway to the next town that had a CT scan, then check everything out, then call the jet. So that's what happened. Overnight, I ended up getting my scan, and I woke up in the morning in the Terrace Hospital with a doctor telling me, yes, we did the scan, you're having a small stroke. We've called the jet, you're on your way back to Vancouver. At this point, though, everything was fine. I felt fine other than the crazy headache and the extreme nausea. I was walking, I was talking, everything was cool. Then I got on the jet, and the last thing I remember is making some horrible jokes with the paramedic who was sitting with me in the back about the fact that I was the, unfortunately, third member of my family that year to use their services and that they must be sick of seeing my last name. And that's the last thing I remember, because that's when my hemorrhage happened. And the plane had to call ahead to the hospital and say, we need consent to do surgery. And they began the effort to try to reach my mom to be able to get consent to do brain surgery, which is a whole other story I'll save for a different day. Following my burr hole surgery, they did the surgery where they drilled 2 holes through my forehead to release the pressure and drain all the excess blood off my brain. I woke in the ICU, still with my headache, but with some new discomfort as well. A nurse was there right away, and she had reiterated that I had had a stroke, but also a giant brain hemorrhage, brain surgery, and subsequently had picked up a meningitis infection. Almost immediately, I started running a shockingly high fever, well over 40 degrees Celsius. I felt like an episode of House at one point. I had 7 teams of specialists trying to figure out where this fever was coming from. They said it didn't fit with stroke, hemorrhage, or even the meningitis. They couldn't understand why I had such a severe fever. The doctor kept saying this is not a survivable temperature, but all they could do was pack my body in bags of ice. I would have bags of ice surrounding my body, and the nurse would come in with a basin of rubbing alcohol and ice and give me ice and alcohol baths, which I can tell you is one of the most exceedingly uncomfortable things you could ever experience. On one day, I was scheduled for 2 biopsies to investigate a couple of cancer theories that they had to explain my excessively high fever. Fortunately, before they went in to do the biopsies, someone figured out that this fever was actually being triggered by a severe allergic reaction to the meningitis antibiotics that they were giving me. Unfortunately, the drug didn't stop there. The allergic reaction obviously caused a lot of problems for me, but it continued to wreak havoc on my body. And one of the other things that it did was it made my veins shut. And so it became impossible for them to place an IV anymore. And because they were still doing things that required access to my veins, they ended up deciding to install a PICC line into my heart, which would have been a great idea, except for in my sleep and in my delirium, I was often finding myself really uncomfortable with both the drains coming out of my head, the PICC line, my catheter, you name it. Anything that was bothersome was itchy and uncomfortable. And in my sleep, I decided those things didn't need to be there anymore, and I would rip them out. So after a few weeks of this, my poor nursing staff finally got sick of my shenanigans and decided to start restraining me by the wrist at night so that I wouldn't harm myself anymore. Unfortunately, all that made me do was want to become Houdini, and I would manage to get myself free from my shackles every night, and in doing so, severely damaged both shoulders. So I just, at some point through this story, you start to think, oh my gosh, you can't make this stuff up. And that's really how it's felt, honestly, the whole way through. At this point, I'm bilaterally paralyzed. I'm fully using a wheelchair. My hands don't work properly. I can't hold a cup of tea or a glass of water without dumping it all over myself. And things had gone from bad to worse very, very quickly. Aside from some of the obvious errors that were made, I've never doubted that the care teams that I had truly wanted to help me. I was shocked, however, to frequently hear, "We want to help you, but we're just not really sure how." As a 38-year-old healthy female, I didn't represent the stereotype of the stroke patient that they were used to. When my deficits and challenges looked different from those with aphasia or swallow challenges, I was told, "We don't know how to help you with that." So I'd get the gold star because I was relearning how to walk and relearning how to use my limbs, and everything like that was going well, but I was not getting any help with some of the issues that I had, such as getting back the use of my dominant left hand. And I mean, here we are almost 11 years ago, and I still don't have the ability to write properly. Like so many who experience stroke, my mental health really began to suffer. I suffered depression, anxiety, severe fear of recurrence. My neurologist had labeled me cryptogenic and said, "There's no way to explain why this happened to you. But don't worry, it'll never happen again." And I said, "Well, how on earth am I supposed to not worry it'll never happen again if you can't tell me and explain to me why this happened in the first place?" So this anxiety and the fear of recurrence started to be something that was really prevalent for me in my mind in the hospital. I was desperate to get home and reclaim my independence. After all, at 38 years old, I'd been on my own since 17, and I had just bought my own home. I was, a successful executive. I had the world at my feet. I thought everything was wonderful. And I thought if I could just go back to normal, I could make this all go away. But the closer I got to going home, I became aware of the strange turn my life had taken. The last I remembered, I was a successful senior vice president, had purchased my own home, and lived a very full life. Now I was not allowed to use the bathroom alone, have a shower, use the stairs, or even eat a meal without someone watching me. This really instilled fear in me and made me feel like I needed permission for everything in my life. I had also been suffering from an effect called confabulation, where I was living in an alternate universe a lot of the time, and my reality didn't match up with actual reality. So almost every single day, I was being told either by family or the hospital staff that I was not correct and that what I was thinking or saying didn't happen and wasn't real. So I was also not trusting myself, and this further impacted my mental health at this point. I was so lucky during that phase that my mom was by my side the entire time. She not only was there at my hospital bed for the entire nearly 4 months that I was in the hospital, but she was able to come home with me and spend a few months helping me transition back to home, which was wonderful. It was a huge shock coming home and being confronted every day with challenges that I couldn't have anticipated. I also couldn't have anticipated suddenly feeling like I had no agency in my life. Am I allowed to? Is this safe? All of these questions were on my mind all the time about things that I hadn't been doing for the last 4 months in the hospital. Was it okay to do this again? It was the most bizarre thing for me to experience this. But it also furthered my spiral into depression. I would absolutely love to help change the way stroke survivors are prepared to go home, setting us up for success and not for living in fear. In those first several months of being home, I learned that just like the hospital, the community was also not really equipped to help a stroke survivor like me. I met with the executive director of the Stroke Recovery Association of BC, and he confirmed that there were no supports for people like me, and that I was about 40 years younger than most of their clients. But he recognized it was a gap in their offering, and after a few more discussions, he invited me to join the board and become the voice of the younger survivor. After being invited to join the board of SRABC, I found my voice mattered again, and I was not only respected but appreciated. After a year, I furthered my efforts and joined the Patient Voices Network and the BC Stroke Services Rehab Collaborative. They had me reliving and retelling my story repeatedly from stage. At first, I couldn't get through it without dissolving into a puddle of tears. But as time went on and my advocacy work expanded to include several more roles, I found that I felt like my experience could help others as well as to change the system for the better. I realized that this sharing of such a dark time had evolved into something incredibly cathartic for me. I credit the people I was collaborating with at the time, as they made my engagement a very safe space for me to be vulnerable and to share my story. This has been the foundation of how I'm living in my recovery. I continue to advocate for system change and for stroke survivors. Combining this with both informal and formal peer mentoring has also become something that has helped in my own mental health and recovery. Providing inspiration to someone in the early stage of their recovery is incredibly rewarding and goes a long way to helping me feel like something good has come from this nightmare. One thing I've talked about a lot in my advocacy is the role that Pilates has played in my physical recovery, specifically getting out of and staying out of a wheelchair. With my injury, a lot of the blood from my hemorrhage ran down my spinal cord and pooled in my back. Add to that the meningitis infection and prolonged extremely high fever, and I had a lot of nerve and tissue damage in my back. As I was getting discharged, it was quietly suggested by my physiotherapist that I seek out clinical Pilates to help regain the stability through my torso to walk again. I truly believe this played a big role in my physical recovery. What I haven't spoken of as much is the role that therapy has played in my mental health and my emotional healing. When I started doing my Pilates training outside of the neuro rehab clinic, I was out in the community and I discovered something amazing. Almost everyone in there was recovering from an injury of some kind. And I no longer felt like I stuck out as a stroke patient. I was now just a student with an injury just like everyone else. I started to thrive quickly, and just past the 2-year mark of discharge, I was trekking in Nepal. My point is that personal agency has a major role to play in healing and recovery, and yet I don't feel it's really considered much. As is necessary, our time in hospital focuses on keeping us safe, yet the unintended consequence of so many rules and restrictions is that fear leaches into the rest of your life. It's not just about being told you can't use the washroom by yourself. It's about being home and trying to rebuild your life and feeling like the action or activity wasn't specifically approved during discharge, then it's not safe to do. I've had this conversation countless times while peer mentoring, where I'm often asked, how is it that I'm walking around in heels now? And I explain the role that Pilates played in my physical recovery, and the response is often, oh, I'm not allowed to do that. And this seems to be the common belief that if it wasn't on a list that said it was an okay activity, then we're not even going to try to do it. This loss of agency has come up repeatedly in the majority actually, of the peer visits that I've done. No matter how long the length of hospital stay, many people have been left with this same feeling. I would love to see stroke survivors empowered as they leave hospital, not just to safely boil water, but to truly step back into their agency and take control of their own recovery. This is definitely one aspect that makes peer mentoring so important. I'll leave you with a little success story. A few years ago, I met a lovely woman who I'll call S. She was in GF Strong following her stroke and was looking forward to going home. When I asked her about her life before her stroke, she said that she and her husband were on the cusp of retirement and were looking forward to doing lots of traveling. We spoke for a while about the travel that I had done post-stroke, and she seemed astonished that I would even attempt it. We've had a few more conversations about it over the past few years and have stayed in touch on social media, and she has followed me as my new travel consultancy was getting off the ground. I recently heard from her, and they were wanting to take a cruise that they had postponed, but only if they could get health insurance. I explained that I was confident I was going to be able to get them affordable coverage, and that if they had been medically cleared to travel, then that they absolutely should and go and enjoy themselves. I'm thrilled to report that last week I heard from S, and she and her husband had a fantastic time and had the peace of mind that they would be covered should either have a medical issue. Probably my most satisfying travel booking to date. Evidence of the power of peer mentoring and reclaiming personal agency. I can't sit here and tell you that I always choose happiness every day. I don't believe that gratitude for my survival and frustration with my circumstances must be mutually exclusive. I think my survival has earned me the right to be frustrated and sad about what I've lost and what I've had to give up, while also choosing gratitude and perseverance. Giving up has never been an option. Thank you for your time. I look forward to speaking with you and seeing if anybody has any questions.
And I'm the Director of Health Systems and Policy for Heart and Stroke in Atlantic Canada. And on behalf of Heart and Stroke, the Canadian Partnership for Stroke Recovery, and the Canadian Stroke Consortium, I want to thank Angela for her passionate talk today about her experience. The work that she's doing in the stroke community in Canada is extremely valuable to all of us. From her work with the Young Stroke Survivors Group to Stroke Services BC and Heart and Stroke, she's truly making a positive impact for those impacted by stroke. And I think we can all say that we're very honored to have attended her lecture today. Unfortunately, we were hoping to get both Frank and Louise Nieboer to be able to provide some remarks, but we're having some technical difficulties. I'm not seeing an email come through that I'm supposed to get, so I think we'll move forward with welcoming Anita back on the stage and perhaps be able to connect them a little later.
So I would just like to add my thank you to Angela for that excellent presentation. And we're now going to proceed to the Hnatyshyn Lecture. This lectureship was established in 2003 in honor of Canada's 24th Governor General, Raymond J. Hnatyshyn, who passed away in 2002. Mr. Hnatyshyn was a founding board member of the Canadian Stroke Network and also a very strong supporter and advocate of stroke research in Canada. The Hnatyshyn Lecture is the most prestigious stroke lectureship awarded to a healthcare professional in Canada and falls under the leadership of the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada in collaboration with the Canadian Stroke Consortium and the Canadian Partnership for Stroke Recovery. In the past, this lectureship was traditionally presented at the Canadian Stroke Congress, and any of you who have attended the Stroke Congress in the past, I'm sure would agree with me that that was one of the best attended and engaging sessions of Congress. It was also really a highlight when Mr. Hnatyshyn's wife, Gerda Hnatyshyn, was able to attend that presentation. And we certainly extend a warm thank you and welcome to any of Mr. Hnatyshyn's family members who may be in attendance today. The Hnatyshyn Lecture is awarded to a healthcare professional who has made a significant and positive impact on brain health through their contribution to research, clinical care in any discipline, systems change, and/or support for people with lived experience in the field of stroke in Canada. This contribution may be over a period of time or may be a significant innovation to clinical care, systems, technology, products, programs, or policies which have a demonstrated impact. So with that note, I will pass the podium over to Dr. Marilyn McKay-Lyons, who will introduce our 2022 Hnatyshyn Lecturer, Dr. Janice Eng. Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you, Anita. I'm going to be looking at Janice, who's sitting in the front here in a white blazer. So it is truly an honor for me to have this opportunity to introduce Dr. Janice Eng as this year's recipient of the Hnatyshyn Lectureship Award. And it's especially exciting for me to do so in my hometown of Charlottetown. So many of you will already know of Janice's many accomplishments, but for those who don't, I'll provide a brief snapshot of why she is just so deserving of this prestigious award. To me and countless others, Janice is the quintessential physiotherapist, researcher, scholar, educator, mentor, colleague, you name it. Without exception, or without question rather, Janice can be said to have changed the stroke rehabilitation on a global level. That's for sure. She is the author of many different and novel stroke intervention protocols, and I'm sure some of the people in the audience have used these protocols. They include, among others, the GRASP protocol, which Janice and her team designed to improve the outcomes of upper extremity function after stroke. And this GRASP protocol has been used in over 1,300 centers globally, in fact, 47 different countries. So it speaks to the global impact that Janice has had on stroke rehabilitation. Another example, and only by example, is the FAME protocol, which is the fitness and movement exercise protocol for community-based rehab. And it in itself has been used to date by over 500 centers in Canada and the United States to improve recovery after stroke. And another more recent example is the DOSE protocol that was designed and is used to enhance ambulation after stroke. And those are only by example. There are many others. So, Janice has obtained over $36 million in operating grants alone for her work. She's mentored over 30 graduate students, many of whom have gone on to obtain faculty positions throughout Canada and internationally. She's published, and I'm green with envy with this one, over 290 peer-reviewed publications, many as first or lead author or senior author. And just think about this. She has there have been over 67,000 citations of Janice's work in the literature. An amazing impact. And among the many testaments of her contributions and commitments have been the UBC Killam Professorship, the Fellowship in the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, the March of Dimes, and Canada and the Jonas Salk Award for Lifetime Achievement in Science and Medicine, the YWCA Women of Distinction Award, and quite recently an honorary doctorate from Laval University. Before I turn the mic over to Janice, I'd like to share just a few quotes from the people who supported this very important lectureship award. Dr. Eng exemplifies everything this award is meant to celebrate. We would be thrilled to have the opportunity to celebrate her accomplishments and contributions to stroke recovery, research, and practice in Canada. And here we are today, doing exactly that. Another quote, Dr. Eng has become one of the most influential academics in neuro-rehab in Canada through her clinical research and her pragmatic, yet tireless promotion of knowledge translation in clinical practice. Dr. Eng has dedicated her career to improving the lives of individuals post-stroke, particularly focusing on the role of exercise to optimize recovery. And lastly, and I think this is my own quote, I can think of no other Canadian researcher who has had a greater influence on stroke rehabilitation and clinical practice, both nationally and internationally. So, Janice, we are just thrilled and absolutely proud of all your accomplishments. So, come on up.
I have to share one story. Thanks so much, Marilyn, about the kudos. Marilyn and I, a few years ago, we did a very raucous debate at the one of the Heart and Stroke Foundation annual conferences, and I still get people who come up to me and said, I love that debate that you guys did. It was on aerobic training. And unfortunately, although I totally support aerobic training, I had to be on the no side of the debate, which was very, very difficult. Marilyn, in fact, brought out all these hats that she wore, and I can't actually remember who won, but thanks so much. So I'm delighted to be here in PEI and commend all of you locals really for your resiliency in this really last terrible hurricane. I spoke with a number of people on the plane on the way here, 85-year-old man who told me he had been without any power for 6 days, and just really told me all sorts of stories of neighborly help that he experienced. So kudos to you for coming through this. I'm going to speak about moving stroke research to the community to benefit people with lived experience. And with that, I really wanted to step back and thank Angela Wright for her advocacy on behalf of people living with stroke. I really enjoyed your talk, Angela. Angela has actually provided advocacy on one of my formal studies that she was on board and provided a lot of input, and I know for many other researchers as well. Oh, there we go. In terms of conflicts of interest, I consult for a company called BrainQ, but I won't be discussing that today. I'd also like to acknowledge that the land that we gather on today here in PEI, Charlottetown, is a traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are grateful to live, work, and play here. I'm honored, really, truly, to provide the Hnatyshyn Lecture today. As already described by Dr. Mountain, the Hnatyshyn Lecture was established in 2003 in honor of Canada's 24th Governor General, Raymond Hnatyshyn, who was very, very much a strong advocacy for stroke research and stroke work. So I'm going to talk today about knowledge translation, one of my favorite subjects. And many of you have heard the statistic. It takes 17 years on average, to move research into practice. And that's just crazy when you think about it. I mean, you have something that you spend a lot of money on, you do clinical trials, and it works. Why isn't it simply adopted? And there are many, many reasons for that, but it does take a long time. I hope I convinced you today that we've actually started to see that we can shorten the time really with some efforts, particularly with funding to really understand how do we move things into practice. So historically, researchers have not been concerned about the gap between research and practice. We've been concerned about publishing our work, but not really getting it out there. And we really haven't been rewarded for that in the past. And that is starting to change when we go out for tenure and promotion as regular professors, that we actually get some credit for moving our research into practice. Secondly, funding agencies haven't really funded implementation research in the past. And this is something we really need to wake up upon. I'm really proud that Canadian scientists and a good number of stroke scientists here are leading the way in knowledge translation. We do need to put things into perspective, though, in terms of time, and I know I'm also always a bit rushed in why we're not there yet, but the journal Implementation Science, which really is the flagship journal, was really only launched in 2006. So, you know, the field as a whole is relatively new. It's less than 20 years old. And if you put it in perspective, something like epidemiology is hundreds, if not 1,000 years old. And even the rehab sciences, rehabilitation medicine, really was published first in really modern day journals about 100 years ago at least. So in comparison, we're really a very, very young science. So it is going to take some time. The Implementation Science Journal is dedicated to study methods to promote the systematic uptake of research. into routine practice. And that's something I really emphasize to you. The word routine practice is really important. So it's not just doing it once, but can you actually get it to sustain and get it continually going in the health services or the community where it's supposed to have its benefits. Dr. Ian Graham was appointed VP of Knowledge Translation at the Canadian Institute of Health Research, which is our main health research funding body, again, only in 2006. And really fortunate for us to have such a lead who really pushed the envelope trying to get more funding for implementation research, implementation science. And this has made a huge difference. We happen to also be really fortunate that Dr. Graham has actually done a lot of stroke research. He was actually the lead for the Stroke Recovery and Motion Planner that Dr. Nancy Sahlbeck presented this morning at our workshop, and really helped to get that into action. He is the innovator of the Knowledge to Action framework that you're seeing up there. And it really provided a very common sense guide how you break down the steps to do implementation science, to implement something that was not so daunting. So what does it say here? Well, you need to, for starters, have in the middle a knowledge base. And so with that knowledge base, you can then prioritize what is it at the bottom that you're going to select for knowledge. There's a lot of things that need fixing, but what is the priority? And hopefully you figure out those priorities with your stakeholders, consumers, as well as healthcare providers, policymakers. And then you will need to adapt that knowledge to local context. So something that you implement in PEI here in Charlottetown is not going to be the same as implementing it back in Vancouver, British Columbia. You need to then assess the barriers to knowledge use, again with your stakeholders to provide input, and then select, tailor, and implement what you're going to do, monitor its use, evaluate the outcome, and lastly, really the most important factor is to sustain the knowledge use. And that has been particularly challenging with COVID. As all of you know, in our hospital systems and community systems, everybody is short-staffed. So trying to implement something new or something revised is particularly difficult. So what is it that we should move into practice in stroke rehabilitation? As Dr. Graham suggested, prioritizing what your options are is one of the first steps. So this was a consensus study that we did with over 100 people with lived experience and over 500 healthcare providers who provided input into this consensus exercise. Thanks to my postdoc, Dr. Louise Berg, who painstakingly sorted through all the data that we had from many countries for this study. These are actually the top areas that we found at the end of the study that were prioritized. So they had to have strong evidence, they had to be feasible, and they had to be deemed by our stakeholders that they were important to translate into practice or into the community. And I'm going to speak about two of them today. One is on the topic of intensity to enhance motor recovery. And the other related one is, we've heard a lot today at this conference, is transitions in care. So just starting with the knowledge, as Dr. Graham said, you really need to ensure that the knowledge you have is very sound before you move anything into practice. So what do we know about motor recovery after stroke? For starters, if you look at something like muscle strength, we know that 3 repetitions of, good, weights or a good amount of resistance will lead to improvements in muscles. Unfortunately, 3 sets of 10 does not result in improvements after stroke. So what we do know is that thousands of repetitions are needed to improve the brain after stroke. And the other thing we now also know is a number of people have done studies looking at how much do people actually get as they go through the rehabilitation journey. And unfortunately, it is on the order of dozens, not even hundreds. So really trying to move that bar to something that is really going to improve the plasticity of the brain, and ultimately then improve motor function. So with this in mind, several years ago, my team developed the GRASS program. It's called the Graded Repetitive Arm Exercise Program. And I really mentor particularly my junior trainees coming up through the system to really come up and spend a lot of time. It might seem trivial, all these acronyms that we develop, but they are really important knowledge translation tools. So when we develop the GRASS program, and then the clinicians are aware of, and also consumers, oh, that GRASS program, oh yeah, that has to do with these exercises for your arm. So it really goes a long way. Spend some time developing, because they are a free knowledge translation tool that you can use, and goes a long way. So this program, it wasn't rocket science. It was really a practical guide of adds about 1,000 repetitions per day, so certainly more than the few dozen that patients were getting in the hospital. And it resulted in meaningful improvements in arm and hand function. We published these multi-site trials. This was originally led by my doctoral student, Jocelyn Harris. And we developed really detailed manuals and standardized protocols, and we provided them free on the internet. With that, we found that the knowledge translation or move to practice really was phenomenal in the GRASS. As Marilyn had mentioned, it is used in many sites. I know of at least 1,600 sites in over 42 countries, and those are the ones that actually have told me. Because it's free on the web and people download it, I don't always know if people implement it, but these are the ones that we know that have actually implemented it. We've actually surveyed the National Physical Therapy Association for Neurorehabilitation in the UK, and over 35% of the UK therapists said they used GRASS. So we know the uptake is actually much higher. It was added as part of the Canadian Best Practice Guidelines based on our trial, which is a high rigorous randomized, multi-site randomized controlled trial. And one interesting fact that I have found is actually used in a lot of paradigms now in conjunction with neuromodulation. Because neuromodulation, which I think is going to be one of the real promising treatments down the road for stroke, is where you stimulate either the brain or the spinal cord in conjunction with intensive activity. You need to have some type of standardized physical activity program with it, and the GRASS is one that can be done with neuromodulation techniques such as transcutaneous magnetic stimulation or spinal cord stimulation as well. So what has helped to move GRASS into practice? Well, first of all, we started with really strong evidence, and that really is a must, so that it was published in rigorous randomized controlled trials showing that it worked. And it was an inexpensive treatment that could be adopted in today's healthcare practice. Now, I do a lot of other work that is not necessarily inexpensive. I've worked with exoskeletons, robotics, neuromodulation as well, and I think they truly have lots of promise as well. But the one thing about GRASS was it could be implemented the next day. It was a matter of putting out the books, and there really was very few barriers because it was very low resource. It's also used a lot in developing countries where they don't always have access to formal therapies as well. It was a very standardized protocol that was very detailed, that could be replicated. And we provided free detailed instructions. And I think this is really critical. It seems really simple, but the fact is, when you look at most clinical trials that are published, that's all you see. And you try to infer exactly what do they do in the 10 pages that are written in the journal, when most of it is actually describing, the background and discussion and a little teeny bit on the methodology. You can't figure out exactly what they did so that you can actually implement it in your practice. So we have very, very detailed protocols, pictures, and whatnot on there. GRASS has been translated in multiple languages. Many of the translations, somebody does them somewhere and they actually send them to me. We host them. I hope they're correct because I can't always tell. But really, we want to disseminate it as wide as we can. So one of the things we did along the way is to really work on fidelity. And this is a point that is really important for knowledge translation. And early on, one of my former postdocs, Dr. Louise Connell, discovered that you simply can't give something to a clinician or a patient and always expect them to be able to do it as you imagined. What we found is really rehab interventions are complex, and even something like the grass, which has pictures and whatnot, we found that clinicians were giving to the patients, and that's all. They weren't following up on it. They weren't giving, equipping the patients. So we really tried to identify what makes grass grass. We came up with another acronym, the ECLIPSE, and these are what we call the active ingredients, or the must-do components of grass. And I think this is something that we really need to do much more of in the rehabilitation sector, where we don't always identify what is most critical to be effective. So in this case, there's a lot of aspects of grass, but you must equip the patient with the book. You must coach the patient. You must have them log the time that they're actually doing it. This is critical for accountability and motivation. Involving the patient with their family and the caregivers. We found in our papers those individuals that had support for the family and caregivers actually did better, no matter what level of function they actually started with. Need to progress the patient weekly so that it's always challenging, and we provide really concrete examples. If you're picking something up and practicing and you're not dropping it every 5 times, it's too easy. So really explaining to the patient why it needs to be so challenging and frustrating, because we really need to work on improving the plasticity of the brain. Motivating that patient and really encouraging them to use the hand, not just during the GRASS program, but in everyday living at home activities. We spent a lot of time at the front end implementing GRASS in the hospital setting. That was fairly easy, in part because you already have a structure around the hospital, physical therapists, occupational therapists, whatnot. But what we were finding is that, as you know, the time in the hospital, both inpatient and outpatient, is just getting shorter and shorter. And because of that, we really wanted to move the GRASS program out in the community, because we know when patients are moved to the community, they're still really quite early after stroke and still have a lot of time and potential for that early recovery. So we really wanted to partner with some type of community partnership, and we work with a number of community centers. This is one that we worked in Vancouver, the Killarney Community Center, and it is really typical of the kinds of communities that we work with. They have a pool, a rink, a fitness center, and meeting rooms where we actually run the GRASS program. And these are really important to have that kind of range of program where people can not only go to GRASS program, but they can go to the hot lunch program, they can go to their fitness room and gym. Most recently, this community center, like many other community centers, are really expanding their pickleball program so they can go out and play pickleball as well. So really just trying to increase the variety of community activities that people with stroke might want to engage in, really critical for community reintegration. The other real advantage we found with community centers, whether it's a YMCA or something like this, is that we are finding that people working in the community centers are having much more experience with people with chronic conditions or chronic health conditions. It started out years ago with the Healthy Heart program, which, as you know, have been in YMCAs and community centers for decades now. And so these instructors not only have experience with people with, post-heart attack, but they've also started to run, for example, in BC, we have a large program that's run called OsteoFit with people with osteoporosis, and more recently with Parkinson's disease. So with that, we've been able to tap into these instructors who want to expand to a repertoire of working with people with stroke and have some experience working with people with chronic disease. So moving our grass program into the community really developed a network for us, developing a program that really tried to motivate people to use their hand more and provide some accountability as they did the grass program, because it's hard to do by yourself at home. So participants actually do the grass program at home, and then they meet really weekly with a cohort, share their goals and accomplishments, the challenges relevant to their arm and the hand, and they brainstorm solutions and barriers and motivate each other. So really coming together as a support group. They learn about different practice techniques, and we've seen many people develop friendships well beyond the grass program. This particular paper outlines just some of the results that we had from running a community grass program, and this is the Fugel-Meyer motor recovery scale, just showing that we were getting clinically important changes, even with people with quite chronic stroke. And we really found that in this particular study, it really was an implementation study. So we didn't go out and recruit participants. We simply registered it, and it was shown up in the community center guide. People then registered for the program because they wanted to participate in the grass program. And then we approached them and said, hey, we've seen that you registered for this program. Would you like to be part of our study? We want to actually do some measurements on you. So it was part of routine care in terms of a community program. They actually paid for it. It was about $10 or $12 per session. And the community center advertised the program, as they do with all their programs. So this was really, really supported by the community center. It was run, and after it was finished, it continued to run as a regular community center program after we had pulled away from the program. When the pandemic hit, we partnered with the After Stroke BC and March of Dimes Canada to pivot the grass into a virtual setting. This actually had a lot of advantages because of the fact that we could be reaching people well outside of the Vancouver region. So it actually spread to different health authorities in BC, as well as they picked up a couple people outside the province of BC as well. So the pandemic hit in March of 2020, and we worked with the March of Dimes on the logistics and launched the virtual grass program just at the end of that summer in 2020. We ran 2 cycles of it, each 10 weeks, and evaluated it. And we actually had the paper was fast-tracked and published in January in print in 2021. I think it's one of the fastest papers we ever published. And I'm really, really glad. We've had a lot of feedback writing to us saying that they've now implemented this in their own community, which is fantastic. And just a huge thanks to my postdoc, Dr. Qilin Yang, who really led this project. This is just showing just one of our clips of the virtual grass program and some of the outcomes. This is the hand scale on the stroke impact scale, which is a scale one of my colleagues, Dr. Pam Duncan, developed, and showed that we had, for the most part, meaningful improvements. So actually very similar results with our virtual program as in person. And what actually really surprised me is how much social support that people got from this virtual program. I wasn't sure about that. And just to show you some of the comments that we had, just on the right here, one of our people living with stroke said, the community aspects of being with other participants and getting to know them made me feel less alone and supported. And this was for our virtual program. And on the other side, I think the best part of the class was constant insistence that we use affected arm, and we find new ways of using it. We're encouraged to share our ideas and bring 1 or 2 new ideas to class every week. So this program is continuing to run. I just trained a number of instructors early in the fall, and it will be delivered now well beyond nationally with the March of Dimes Canada, so beyond BC. So really eager to see how that rolls out. Well, implementation is always at the front of my mind. We are always trying to continually look at innovation as well. This is an ongoing study led by my doctoral student, Lisa Simpson, who is using a wrist device here, which actually counts how much you open and close your hand. As you can imagine, you can count the number of minutes you do grasp. We recommend an hour per day, but you don't really know if someone does 1,000 repetitions or they do 200 repetitions. So this actually provides a count of how many times you open and close your hand. And we're combining the grasp program with targets in this study. We just finished recruitment and we're just analyzing this data right now. So hopefully this kind of technology will help some of the accountability and make these kind of programs easier in the future. I'm just going to switch gears and talk about some of our mobility after stroke. This is a program, our fitness and mobility exercise program, that we developed through a series of randomized controlled trials. All our manuals, again, are free, are available at fameexercise.com. These studies were done with very rigorous randomized controlled trials. I feel very strongly about trials involving active control groups. So for the most part, we did several studies here, but they generally have a control group that is doing weight shifting, a standing balance, yoga, tai chi, because the very first study I did was a randomized controlled trial, which was in the late 90s. We actually had people come to GF Strong and they sat on a very expensive machine and did maximal resisted exercise, pushing against the lever, going up and down. And we found, as we expected, they actually improved their strength. We had a control group also come to GF Strong and they just sat on the machine and the machine went up and down passively and they didn't exert any activity. What we found from that very first study I did was that the control group who had to come to GF Strong actually improved in their walking. And they hadn't done anything actively, but the fact is they had to get up, come out of their house 3 times a week, come to GF Strong, get from whether the handy dart or the parking lot, walk into the center, and that probably was more activity than they were normally doing. As we know, many people with stroke are sedentary. So if we really want to tease out whether it's our intervention that's working or just getting people out of the house that's working, we really need to control our studies with something that is very relevant, that is control that people are still also coming to the center 3 times and getting attention in similar manner. So this is something I feel quite strongly about. In our FAME studies, we've run several randomized controlled trials. Generally, there are 60 minutes and at least twice a week, and typically have a ratio of 4 participants to 1 instructor. And we've shown through these randomized controlled trials that we can improve balance. We've reduced falls over the next 12 months after you have finished the FAME program, improve walking speed, balance, cardiovascular fitness, VO2 peak, muscle strength. We maintain bone density while our control group actually lost bone density. And we just published a paper just came out last week, and it's in the high impact journal JAMA Open. And in this trial led by my colleague, Dr. Teresa Lou Ambrose, we had 3 groups, a FAME group, a group that was doing low activity on their feet, so they were doing stretching, weight shifting, low activity. And we had a 3rd group that was actually a social and cognitive retraining activity. And we showed in this particular paper that the FAME group did better than the other 2 groups in improving cognition, executive function. So we're really excited. This is one of probably the largest and strongest trials to really link and definitively show that exercise can improve cognition post-stroke. Really important given the high rates of vascular dementia that we see following stroke, and really double the risk of having Alzheimer's after stroke. So hopefully we can start to look at exercise as prevention as well for dementia following stroke. With the FAME study, similar to the GRASS, we've really tried to develop some fidelity. This is the FAME principles, and we have a checklist to see whether people are actually, the instructors are actually adhering to the protocol to ensure that we get the kind of fidelity and intensity that we have. So they're looking at the progression, the repetitions, intensity. Are they actually monitoring it? Are they actually considering normal movement? And when we say normal posture movement, are they looking at normal biomechanics, normal symmetry of the movements, and are they including the normal components of functional strengthening, agility, and balance and fitness? One of my colleagues, Dr. Krista Best from Laval University, looked at adapting the FAME program for a virtual program over the pandemic and published that recently this year, showing good improvements with the FAME program and the fact that it was safe and feasible. And just one of our last informative slides, just telling you that partnerships are absolutely critical when you implement. And I just want to give you a sample for this paper we just published this year. In this particular study, my team trained a group of physical therapists, rehab assistants, and community fitness instructors in Kelowna, in the interior health of BC. In this case, we trained outpatient physical therapists who were wanting to know how to deliver FAME as a group program in the outpatient setting. And we also trained at the same time the fitness instructors who wanted to deliver in the community center. They also have a health navigator that was already existing there that worked a couple days in the community center to help people with chronic disease get into the right programs following a hospital stay. So this was really ideal. It was really similar to the pathway of the Healthy Heart program, which has existed for decades, where people have a heart attack, they experience a healthy heart in the hospital and gain confidence with it, then they go home and they go into that healthy heart or happy heart in their community, and they're familiar with the program. So this was the same kind of transition in care where people started the FAME program in the hospital, then they transitioned to home and were able to continue with the FAME program, again, with the program they were familiar with, but now led by fitness instructors in the community setting. With this particular setup, we were able to show that we reduced the hospital wait time for physical therapy services by 30 days for 1 month. And this was because the therapist or their team was more confident in being able to discharge people home and knowing that they could actually continue their mode of recovery with a program that was existing. So we had a really nice flow. The other thing about the training, because we did it all together, was that the physical therapists met the fitness instructors where they normally don't talk to each other. And so this was also really helpful that they knew each other. The community fitness instructors could go back up to the hospital and knew who the referral pathway was from. So just setting that up was really, really helpful. So just my last slide, who will move research to practice? All of you are really key to moving research to practice. Those that have lived experience, hopefully you will continue to lobby funding agencies, nonprofits to try to increase funding for implementation activities. We do get money for research, but often there's a real gap in that implementation is left so that you run a trial and that's it. And we really need to see it go further. Those that are of you that are researchers, I hope, we've already heard today, many of you are already implementing research. Those that you are not, I hope I've inspired you to continue to try to implement your research into practice in the hospital or community. And those of you that are healthcare providers, I hope that, I know many of you are already involved with implementing best practice and will continue to do so. I've been very fortunate to work with a number of Atlanta partners here already. I have a trial was originally the DOSE protocol, now called the Walk and Watch protocol. It's a 12-site implementation trial. It's a step wedge design that we're running. It's running here at Fredericton and also here in PEI, and I've seen therapists here from both sites, and thank you for participating in an implementation trial. Again, trying to build up that evidence so we can really be assured of what are the best methods to implement in practice. Just like to thank the many of some of my team that have been involved, graduate students and staff, instrumental in leading this research, and also our funding agencies with whom without we couldn't do this research. Thanks very much.
So thank you, Dr. Eng, for that fabulous presentation. Your contributions to stroke care definitely exemplify the criteria for all the criteria for the Hnatyshyn Lectureship. You've been so instrumental in forwarding stroke rehabilitation recovery research in Canada, and certainly your mentorship of many junior researchers and students only further amplify your reach and impact. And certainly many Atlantic Canadians have benefited from your research, either by directly participating or by its implementation to clinical care. And I've been asked to present you these in recognition of your lectureship today, so thank you once again. So we'll now move on to the question and answer portion of our lectureships, and I'm sure both our lecturers have inspired many great questions and discussion for the group. For those joining us virtually, we'd ask that you put your questions in the chat function, and those here, if you could go to the microphone, introduce yourself and ask your question, that would be great. Turn it over to Dr. Gubitz here for one more moment.
Great job. That was fantastic. I have several questions, but before we get that, people will come to the microphone. I have comments from the Nieboers who were unable to join us because of technology, but they've sent some written comments about Angela's amazing presentation earlier, so I've been asked to read them to you, and I'm sure you'll agree. Angela, you are an inspiration to us all. Your stroke journey embodies everything that we have strived for over these last 45 years of living with stroke. You provide hope for the future of stroke care. You provide hope for stroke survivors and their families. Your advocacy for improvement in stroke care is needed, as this comes from your lived experience. Stroke care should not end after 6 months, and the healthcare system has to provide the necessary support to survivors of stroke and their caregiving families. They cannot do this alone. On behalf of Louise and myself, thank you for sharing your experiences and most of all your contributions to the improvement of stroke care in Canada. So there you have it. So as Dr. Mountain mentioned, she's monitoring the chat from coast to coast to coast. Are there any people with questions here in the audience who might like to come up to a microphone? We do have a few minutes. While you're thinking about that, oh please, I knew we could count on you. Is she like this at home? Please.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Nancy Solbach, and I'm a great fan of Janice's. Have really been inspired by the research she's done over the years. And my question to you, Janice, was, what is it that is your inspiration for your various projects? Because, I mean, to my mind, they seem just all so perfect and kind of the next step for what we should be, you know, aspiring to do in rehabilitation practice. But, you know, maybe to tell us what leads you to propose a particular study as you've gone along in your career.
Thanks, Nancy, for the question. So I think in the early days, we didn't have such a formalized relationship with our stakeholders, but it was the stakeholders who would continually tell me. We would develop randomized controlled trials, and we would run them, and we'd show they're effective, and then my stakeholders, people with lived experience, would say, but I can't get that program. It's not anywhere near me, and where can I go to get your FAME program, or where can I go to get intensive exercise? So at the beginning, it was really formed by people that I work with and people who took part in our clinical trials who kept bothering us And thank goodness they kept bothering us to say, please do something else. And at that time, as I said, I started in the 90s, there wasn't implementation science, and there wasn't something that, advocacy boards and things like that, which all exist today, which is fantastic that we formalize that process to really get the input from stakeholders of what they need. But it really was stakeholders who really pushed the whole concept of implementation science. Without them, we wouldn't have gotten there. And really, for me, it was the patients who participated in our research who said, we need more. We need more than you to just prove that this works. We need you to help get it into practice. So that really was the inspiration for that.
Wonderful. Yes, indeed. For those of you who are joining us from home, Angela's joined us on the screen as well. Angela, I hope you can hear us. I hope that you heard the lovely comments from Frank and Louise.
I did, thank you.
Are you keeping well? Is the COVID at bay?
I'm a little better today. I had quite a fever yesterday when I was trying to do my presentation, so I hope you'll forgive me if that wasn't the best performance. But yes, I feel like I'm coming out the other side now, thankfully.
Grand. We had no idea at all that you were unwell. Everybody in the audience wants to know what your cat's name is because it was perched on the back of the chair.
That was Taj. And he normally has to crawl all over me when I'm doing a Zoom. So I was really thankful that he stayed put. It was just my moral support yesterday.
All right. So any comments from you? Any things that you would like to impart with us tonight? Or any questions from the audience for Angela or online? Any that I don't know?
Yeah. So we do have a question online. And I think this could go to either one of our lecturers. Do you have any tips to facilitate building the partnership between community and healthcare?
So any tips on creating partnerships between community and healthcare?
So I think one thing as researchers, the one thing that the healthcare understands is saving money or increasing efficiency. So when it's data like ours that we can show like, boy, we put these things together and we show that it reduced the wait time or reduced, the length of stay, that's something that the health authority understands. And I know they should understand quality of life. You would hope that you say, we did these things and improved quality of life, but in my own experience, they go, oh, yeah, quality of life. But if we can actually say that we reduce expenses in some way or increase efficiency of system. So that is going to take working with other partners. It's not my area, but I work a lot with health economists who can help me to get the numbers and do the right kinds of measures that I can change it into qualities or dollars or health economics, because that seems to be the language that the health authority speaks.
Fair enough. Any thoughts about that, Angela?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Dr. Eng is saying, but I also think, some of those earlier types of supports that can happen in community are so important, because the more help somebody gets at the front end of their journey, ideally, the lesser time they're going to need help in total. So, for example, in my talk, I mentioned the fact that I've never really regained the use of my dominant left hand. I'm almost 11 years post-stroke now, and I still can't write properly. It's not, we live in an age of technology, so that's not that big of a deal. But if it was the type of deficit that really impacted me on a daily basis, or I would maybe need to go back into care for it at some point, the economics of it say that it would be far cheaper to help me early on than to come at me years and years later when I have a recurrence or another related medical issue and become, part of the system again and a drain on resources again. So I think, the more we can help with intervention earlier in community with those living with stroke, the lesser the economic impact to the system long term. And I know that's really difficult to put together in terms of actual numbers, but I really believe that big picture, that is the way to make sure that we can continue to have people have better outcomes longer term without creating too much of a financial burden to the healthcare system.
Eminently sensible. Sounds like you could be the new Minister of Health in BC. Any questions from in the room? People are moving to the microphone. Please, go ahead.
It's okay. Can you hear me? Okay. It's not really a question, it's really a reflection on your comment, Angela, around the idea of personal agency. And I wonder about in your journey, at what point that could have been made easier for you.
You were able to hear the question?
Yes, I did. Thank
Okay.
you. And I think it's a great question. And I think, I mean, there are multiple points in my experience that could have, something could have happened to help that not be such a challenge for me. But I think the most integral point would have been that transitional aspect of, you know, when GF Strong was getting ready to send me home, instead of teaching me to boil water, or maybe as well as teaching me to boil water safely, I could have been getting some more tangible skills and even just conversations around some of this sense of how does one reclaim their own power when they go home. And I mean, they knew I was going home by myself. They knew I lived alone. There could have been more that was done to help me, you know, kind of come out of this with a more sense of strength and more of a sense of I can do this, instead of feeling like I had to ask permission for everything. If my poor mom was in the room, she would tell you that I was a shell of myself and was constantly second guessing everything and questioning myself. And if you knew me, you would know that is not my personality normally. So I think at the very least, in that last transitional phase, just before discharge, would be an excellent time to talk a lot about personal empowerment and making your own decisions and it being okay to do these things.
May I ask a follow-up question to that question? So that was 11 years ago, and in that time, since that time, you've become rather a strong advocate, a lot of peer support. Are you still hearing those stories from people, or are we getting better?
I do still hear the stories of people really feeling like they're unsure what's okay. And so I do think there's still quite a bit of work to do in terms of the communication with people in that phase of about to go home, with that, you know, it was not safe for you in those early stages, but you've progressed past that now. You've grown, you've healed, you're in a better place. It is safe, you can do these things, you can make your own decisions going forward. Mm-hmm. I do still think that communication needs to be clearer, because I do still hear it from survivors today.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments online, Anita? Any questions?
Actually, I have a bit of a follow-up question to that as well, Angela, and then there is a comment that I'll read. You know, that the same thing that Rhonda mentioned struck me as you were speaking as well, and I was wondering if some of the discussions that we've had today in the earlier part of the conference is about people being discharged without like having that connection back to a health provider or a navigator, or having someone come to your home to be able to guide you through that. Do you think any of that would be useful in helping restore people's agency, or do you feel that that should be you know, more of those conversations before someone's discharged home, or maybe both?
I think both, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, I don't think anybody's ever going to complain too much about too much help or too much information. You know, like I mean, granted, there can be a lot of information that can be overwhelming, perhaps, to the stroke survivor. But assuming that somebody has some supports, whether that be a spouse or a family member or a friend or a caregiver, that information is so valuable. But I think, you know, it's the partnership between healthcare and community is so crucial and has so far to go in terms of healthcare embracing community supports and letting people like me come into the hospital and be that liaison between people that are ready to go home and what those resources could be out in the community, you know, whether that's After Stroke Canada or something else. You know, there's just a lot that I could be doing, that others like me could be doing, to help ease the burden that healthcare already has, and most importantly, ease the burden of the survivor and their families to have their transition be a little bit smoother.
And then you had a comment.
Thank you. Yes, there's an online comment here for Dr. Eng. Janice, thank you for your leadership and your inspiration for all. Your science, your implementation, your mentorship will ensure stroke care will be transformed for stroke survivors. So again, I just want to take the opportunity to thank Angela for her wonderful talk and also for joining us virtually, and to Dr. Eng for her excellent lectureship. I think at this point we'll leave it there for our virtual audience, but just want to thank them as well for attendance and for the discussion today. So thank you all.